right, good afternoon. It's 3 p.m. on Wednesday, January 26th. I'm going to call the Land Authority meeting to order. And the first item is the agenda review.
Mojo moves to approve.
Okay. Motion by Commissioner Mojo.
Second.
Second by Chuck. Is that Chuck? Okay. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, the same sign. Here, by the way, we should probably do a roll call of this too.
Mrs. Shirley?
I'm here. Thanks, Kevin, for doing this. It's a little awkward to chair it remotely.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Mayor Peterson? Mr. Grubb? Mr. Campbell?
Here.
Mr. Borboom?
Here.
Mr. Hendrickson?
Here.
Mr. Olson?
Here.
Mr. Breitling?
Here.
Ms. Majo?
Here.
Ms. Preston? Mr. Zimmerman? Quorum is present.
Thank you, Don. All right, we'll move into item number 3, selection of committee chair and vice chair for 2022. Do we have a nomination for chair?
I'll nominate Kevin.
I would want to decline that.
You will?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll nominate Commissioner Shirling.
All right. We have a nomination for Commissioner Shirling. Do we have any other nominations? Do we have any other nominations? Third and final call. Any other nominations? Seeing none, all in favor of Commissioner Shirling being chair for 2022, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, the same sign. Motion carried. Now, Mary, I'm assuming you still want me to do this while you still want me to run the meeting for today for you?
Yes, I would greatly appreciate that. I with this setup, I cannot see who's at the table.
Okay.
It's it's not like a Teams meeting where people can raise their hands, and it's even on my computer I can't, I can see the room, but it's it just works better, I think, if the chair is there, and I apologize that I'm not.
Okay, I will take care of that for you. All right, the next we have nominations for vice chair for 2022.
And I would make the motion for Kevin, please. Commissioner Campbell.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second nominations. Are there any other nominations?
And could I just add, I believe, and I could be wrong here, but that the chair and vice chair have to be DA board members. So that kind of limits it.
Okay.
Not that I would want anyone else, Kevin, but just saying.
All right, are there any other nominations of board members? Third and final call. Seeing none, all in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, the same sign. Motion carried. All right, we will move, thank you. We will move into the meeting minutes.
Motion to approve.
Second.
Okay, we had a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, the same sign. Motion carried. Motion carried. We'll move into item number five, flowage easement update. Eric, were you? Oh, you gonna?
Yeah, I think Jody's going to jump right in on this. I've got a few slides that I'll show that I'll walk through while Jody's speaking.
So good afternoon. Thank you for allowing me to speak today. We want to provide you a little bit of update with the flowage easement offer packets. I know there's a lot of anxiety and a lot of excitement about us getting those out of the door. Crown Appraisal has provided us with all the appraisals. We're working through our Jacobs team to make sure that all the compliance is in place with those. They will be brought forward to the various boards at the February board meeting. In the interim, we've been looking at the flowage easement offer packet and have provided that to the joint boards and to the Diversion Authority Board, considered some feedback that you have provided us, additional feedback that we've received from some of our constituents. So you can see from the key improvements here, the simplified packet was put into place based upon our land agents' experiences and relationships. So the meetings that we had with them, because they're the ones who are dealing directly with the constituents, they were able to provide some of that feedback to us that we could take into consideration. It was really valuable to hear from their perspective. We did retain some legal requirements. So Onstead and Twitchell went through that packet, scrubbed it pretty hard for Eric and I. We're still reviewing some of those suggestions to ensure that we're incorporating all those legal obligations. And then we also incorporated the board feedback that was provided to us. So you can see some of the timelines that are set up there. We weren't quite prepared to bring it to you today. I haven't had enough time to kind of get through all of the recommendations and submit that to you for review, but we'll certainly get that to you prior to being submitted to all the landowners. The next one. So the first draft, just kind of walk through some of these changes because I know we just had a communications meeting. Not all of you were able to be there, but we really are trying to improve our communications with the landowners and improve that transparency. The first draft that we had with the offer letter, that if you saw those in December, you'll note when you see this next draft that we have amended it significantly, again, based upon our communications team, aka Amy and Mike, legal, our land agents, and our board members. In the original offer packet, we did have that there was a public meeting that would be addressed. What we've created is a separate invitation with an agenda that'll help our landowners understand what are we going to talk about, who's going to be there, what kind of questions can be answered. One of the recommendations that came to us as far as FAQs. Originally, we have not had that in those packets, but we do have an FAQ. It'll go over what is a flowage easement, what are the various mitigation zones and development restrictions within those mitigation zones, and then what is the ag impact mitigation programs, like the crop insurance, for example. The appraisal reports will be included in the packet. Previously, we did have the flowage easement and the purchase agreement in the packet based upon feedback that we received. Those packets can be, if for just one parcel, over 20 pages. If you have multiple parcels, you'll receive a packet per parcel. So there'd be small boxes sent to some of our landowners. And so what we decided to do is take those flowage easements out and those purchase agreements out. We're just going to have the actual packet itself. We'll let the land agents go and meet with the landowners, and they can work through that. So again, just kind of minimize the amount of information that is being sent so it's clearer and it's not quite as overwhelming. And again, we hope to have that to you here in the upcoming weeks in its final form. And so you can kind of see from our next steps then, once we get this finalized, the goal is for me to have all the feedback from the Diversion Authority partners by Monday. We'll finalize those packets. The land agents will start populating the packets with the various information from the appraisals. So soon after the boards approve those appraisals at the end of February, they'll be going out the door. We also will be having informational meetings in the various communities of March 14th through March 22nd. And again, you will be aware of those meetings when they do occur. Are there any questions I can answer about some of the changes that we've made from our previous packets through the land acquisitions versus the flowage easement packets?
Chuck.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With the purchase agreements and the easements, you said they were in the packet before. What if the landowner wants to get access to it? How would they do that?
That's actually a very good question. So there will be a form flowage easement on our website that they'll be able to go and look at. It won't be this one specific for their property, but we do have contact information there of their specific land agent, and we can mail it to them if they're not comfortable going on the website and downloading those.
Okay, thank you.
I might just add to that, one of the sort of principles that we've tried to employ with our lands program is to allow our land agents to build as good of relationship as they can with the property owners. And so we'll send them this initial packet that Jody just talked about, and hopefully, I guess not hopefully, the expectation is there'll be communication from the land agent to the property owner, and through those communications, providing them the flowage easement will be another real opportunity for them to have meaningful conversations. And so we're sort of forcing that, those conversations to occur. So I think that's, as Jody mentioned, it helps simplify the initial packet, but then also provides a real meaningful touch point afterwards.
Any other questions? Thank you, Jody. Thank you, Eric, on that one.
Kevin,
Yes.
how extensively are you going to talk about crop insurance? Or what's in the packet? How much information is going to be?
The FAQ page about crop insurance is fairly consistent with what we've shared previously, so fairly high level. We did have one focus group meeting back in November where we were able to answer a lot of questions with a select smaller group of producers. And so that, we have information. We can certainly talk to producers at these open house meetings. The material that's going out is primarily reaffirming our commitments that have been made in the settlement agreement and other locations. And so the summary sheets are basically capturing that information as well.
All right. Thank you. All right, we'll move into item number 6, Cemetery Mitigation Plan Presentation. Mr. Shockley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Use the arrows.
All right, is the present?
Yeah, it's
Perfect. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I get the topic of cemetery protection plan, and I worked with staff along with the Diversion Authority members, along with members from HMG and different land management team, along with several core people involved, and we worked to develop a cemetery plan. It's quite a lengthy document, and so my intent today was just to provide a brief overview, and if you have questions, I can certainly respond to those directly. And if you really want to get in depth, I can sit down and meet with you and talk through each of the cemetery projects as we're going forward. And this is really a plan because, as we'll get into it, each of the cemeteries has some unique attributes that require different forms of mitigation. And so just briefly, why are we doing this? The federal EIS states that cemeteries in the staging area will be impacted by the comprehensive project. Early on, the Corps had released a federal cemetery mitigation plan identifying options for impacted cemeteries. That plan was based upon Plan A of the project. And so it included cemeteries that are no longer impacted by the project. Some of the changes that resulted in Plan B had taken some of the cemeteries out of the impact area. More importantly, Minnesota DNR permit condition number 25 requires that the authority address impacts to cemeteries in Minnesota. We have some reporting requirements that as we develop and finalize those plans, we have to report back to Minnesota DNR on that issue. The authority has formed a local cemetery mitigation team to build upon the Corps' original efforts to create a mitigation plan. I will also note that the settlement agreement requires that we provide funds and plans for cemeteries that have been impacted by the project. The PRAM that's been previously approved by the board, and we're working towards more of a finalized PRAM, also envisions a cemetery protection plan. I would note that when I received this task, I immediately started searching on the internet to see if other communities had created a cemetery mitigation plan, and there are not a lot of precedential documents to look at or draw upon how other communities have done it. Most of the solutions involve just simply completely relocating a cemetery. When you had an actual wet dam that staged water permanently, they would just relocate the entire cemetery. So our project is somewhat unique and on many different ways, but clearly in the cemetery mitigation plan, this is unique. The purpose, the original part of the study was Plan A, and that formed the basis for the original study. As a result of Plan B and changes to the project, we've developed a new cemetery protection plan. The plan identifies impacts and mitigation measures for cemeteries in the staging area impacted by the comprehensive project. I thought just visually it might be good to introduce the board to which cemeteries are we talking about that we're going to have mitigation for. And there's 6 that are going to experience potential impacts from the project. They include Clara Cemetery, Eagle Valley, Evangelical Cemetery, and I always get the pronunciation of this wrong, but I believe it's Hemis Cemetery, North Pleasant Cemetery, Rowan Family Cemetery, which is a family plot cemetery, and then Wolverton Cemetery, which is actually included within the city limits of Wolverton and is addressed by the settlement agreement. And then I always thought the pictures are important so that you can see where exactly these cemeteries are located. Some are closer to the embankment while some are farther away from the embankment. So this is a location of Clara Cemetery. And depending upon their location will really dictate what the solution for mitigating the impact to the cemetery are. Currently, what we're working towards with the plan will likely be some type of embankment around the cemeteries that are closest to the southern embankment. Clara is probably a good example of why it is close to the southern embankment. It'll experience some flooding and impacts during project operation. As we researched how to address these types of impacts, obtaining flowage easements across the cemetery can prove challenging for a number of reasons. Different cemeteries have different legal ownership structures, with some plots that are owned in fee simple, some in which the cemetery board controls. And so sometimes getting flowage easements for what appears to be a relatively small area of land can be very complex and administratively burdensome. Also, we want to be very respectful to the families of the people that are buried in the cemeteries, so that may not be the best solution for people who are concerned about their loved ones to have flowage easements across the cemetery. And so we're working with a potential solution for these cemeteries to create earthen embankments. We have outreach efforts with both the Army Corps of Engineers and Minnesota DNR to make sure that they don't necessarily have to be certified levees, but they do have to meet certain heights. Normally you wouldn't, intrinsically, we wouldn't expect that we would need a certified levee around a cemetery. And this also seems to comply with the land requirements that DNR is imposing. And so I think for these cemeteries, that's probably likely to be the solution. The plan includes flexibility in that because we recognize that not all cemeteries, the same solution is not going to work for every single cemetery. Eagle Valley Cemetery, you can see where the location of this is. This is more in southern, actually in northern Wilkin County, Richland County. And there are less impacts to this, but there are some challenges associated with this cemetery. Then the Hemis Cemetery, which has some particular challenges to it. North Pleasant, and for some of these cemeteries that are on the border of the staging area, it might include such mitigation efforts as perhaps a smaller embankment, very short, or maybe fencing to keep debris out, or maybe it's some type of an agreement with the cemetery to provide funding that if there were crop debris that floated in, that we would help pick it up. If through the research that was performed by the Corps, some of these cemeteries that are in the areas that are less likely to have significant flooding, the reports indicated that ice damage was unlikely because the ice is mostly in the channel of the river, and so when it starts to melt, it's mostly snow that and flood waters that impact cemeteries in the Red River Valley. And most of the cemeteries have some type of vegetation around them, which is usually trees. And so they tend to naturally obstruct some of the larger items. and it's really only in these areas that you would have light flooding or crop impacts. And so the cemetery mitigation plan includes some flexibility to work with these cemeteries on what's the appropriate flood protection for the cemeteries, while still trying to respect what the cemetery boards want and make sure that they can continue in their operations and be respectful to the family and family members that are buried at those locations. The Rowan Family Cemetery, I just wanted to include this so you're for awareness where it's located at. Wolverton Cemetery, as indicated, this is actually called out in the settlement agreement that will work with the city of Wolverton in their flood protection efforts, and that will probably be included within the project for Wolverton, is how you protect the cemetery. It sounds like the actual cemetery probably won't incur a lot of flooding itself, but there may be some geotechnical challenges with the location of the cemetery. And so our H&G team is working through that issue. There are 2 cemeteries that are outside of the staging area that have what are referred to as viewshed impacts. And viewshed impacts just simply mean that their current view is impacted by the project. And that's St. Benedict Cemetery and the Lower Wild Rice and Red River. And so the plan calls out how to address those viewshed impacts. Here's St. Benedict's Cemetery, just to give you an idea, that is within the protected area of the project, and then along with the Lower Red River Cemetery. So with the changes to Plan B, that resulted in those cemeteries no longer being within the flood protection area. So the mitigation plan, as with every aspect of this project, when we're dealing with mitigation, we have rules, requirements, and permits to comply with. And so we're required to comply with the Historic Preservation Act. Some of the cemeteries contain some historic value to them under the Historic Preservation Act. And so there are some compliance items that we have to address in the cemetery mitigation plan. And then finally, we have the permit requirements, and that is included within the Minnesota Dam Safety Permit. That's condition number 25. Those apply to cemeteries that are in Minnesota. And as I had previously stated, we are working with the Minnesota DNR regarding removing cemeteries from the impact of the comprehensive project by using ring levees around them. We also have non-federal requirements, which are it can include ring levees, fencing, maintenance requirements, and solutions to eliminate impacts and erosion. And then finally, what are our federal requirements that are contained within the overall project and that are impacted as part of this plan? As it indicated for Zone 1 and Zone 2, we have to obtain flowage easements, which can be challenging on these cemeteries due to the ownership options or ownership issues. And thus, as a result, that's why we're looking into different mitigation alternatives such as ring levees. We also want to make sure that normal cemetery operations will not be restricted by the flowage easement. And so there are just natural challenges with how a flowage easement would operate across the cemetery. And so that's why it appears that the best solution for many of the cemeteries is going to be a ring levee. Can certainly answer any questions. I wanted to kind of keep this short. The plan is fairly comprehensive. I do know it was something that people were interested in, and once the plan's been finalized, and I think the intent is to make that available if there's requests to see it. And then we would probably be giving updates with each of the projects as they move forward.
Mr. Wilson.
John, what about, you put a ring dike around the cemetery, what about the additional maintenance to keep that decent looking?
So great question. We are going to likely have agreements in place with each of the cemeteries that would cover that. I think that the maintenance is probably, because it's not certified, and I would defer to the engineers in the room who can answer the questions about certification of dikes, but the maintenance requirements are probably less because it's not certified. And so it's probably more limited to, maybe providing some reimbursement if there's slumping or some other items like that. And that'll have to be worked out with each cemetery.
It would be more the view shed, and I don't know how, obviously the ones closest to the or the deepest water are going to have the highest dike. And I'm just thinking about, it's an effort to keep these cemeteries up. And if we're going to add more maintenance to a cemetery, are we going to mitigate that? And then one other question, and I'm sure it was brought up because it was mentioned several years ago about raising the stones, the headstones, not relocating the actual burial site, but raising it to get the headstones out of the water. Was that considered, or was that not workable?
That is an option in the plan that would require, I think you would still need to have some sort of legal permission either from the plot owner or from the cemetery, depending upon the legal structure. And that involves adding extra dirt on top of each plot and then relocating the headstone. And there are, at least in both states, there are very specific requirements set forth in the law regarding how you undertake a project like that. But it certainly is an option that's contemplated in the plan. I think one of the challenges will be making sure that the cemetery is comfortable with that, and then also securing the appropriate rights to undertake a project like that.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. John, Mr. Shockley, on the cemeteries that would have the higher earthen levees, or any cemetery for that matter, I would imagine that there could be some potential change to access. I'm assuming that we would work with all those cemeteries in terms of accessibility once those levees are in place.
Yeah, that's actually on the cemetery, and I forget the name, in Minnesota that we've been, let me go back to which one that we've been working on. Clara, we've been talking about the ring levee around that, and then there's been some discussion about what's the proper spacing away from the cemetery and the approach so that it's not too steep. And the engineering team, Chris Bakigard, has been sitting in on those meetings. So I think we'll certainly address those access issues, because that is an important issue, especially with, you can have a variety of vehicles that would access it at any time. It could be from a small automobile up to a large truck or digging equipment in the normal operations of a cemetery.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I have a question, Commissioner Campbell.
Okay, Mary?
John, are there any, thank you, are there any that we're contemplating having to relocate? Seems to me I recall there was one particular cemetery that there was some bank slumping, and those burial sites were kind of in jeopardy already. What happened with that?
Currently, we're not contemplating relocation of any cemeteries. We are aware of the bank slumping at that particular cemetery, and we're working on that solution to that particular issue. But currently, we're not contemplating a relocation. When you relocate a cemetery, there are additional challenges on relocation and additional rules, and of course, administrative costs involved in doing that also.
And then just one other question. On the fringe areas where it's going to be minimally impacted and very infrequently, and you kind of talked about it a little bit, but can you simply just build up the soil on the burial site and then bring up the monument? Is that a possible way to do it? Because I assume that you're going to have access limited anyway. Is that right?
Yeah, that is one option. You can add soil above each of the grave sites, and then you'd have to relocate each of the headstones. That would require access agreements from the cemetery, and depending upon the ownership, because a number of the cemeteries have different ownership system or structures. You may also need permission from the lot owners or plot owners or their next of kin, obviously. And so that could present a challenge in itself, getting permission. And so that's why the plan contemplates either for some of the cemeteries in the fringe area, it could be as simple as fencing around the cemetery to stop debris from floating in. Some of the cemeteries have and Eric would know precisely exactly how much of water is projected to be impacted on each cemetery, but some of them it's fairly limited, and you'd have the likely impact would be from crop debris like corn stalks or something floating in, which could be prevented by either some type of vegetative planting like trees or by fencing or some other combination.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none, we will move into item number 7, property acquisition status report. Eric.
Yeah, thanks, John, for that presentation. I know a lot of work's been going into the cemetery plan, so good to share that with the group. In your packet is the monthly property acquisition status report. I think most of you are familiar with this, but I'll, as usual, hit on a few items. The first page, more just to orientate everybody with the different geographies that we're working in. Second page gives an overall status indication. You know, it's a little bit hard to see here, so I think I'm going to zoom in if that's okay, maybe for my own benefit. As you see here, again, we've acquired everything necessary for the channel. That was some time ago. We do have a number of those properties that are working through the eminent domain process. A number of those eminent domains have already settled. Some of them we've got board agreement on a settlement, and we're just working through the paperwork, and so the report doesn't necessarily reflect it. But the trials for those were scheduled to start in January, and some of the early trials we've reached a settlement agreement. And so I guess I'm happy to report that, and I know the board's been given strong consideration to those actions, and so we'll see how those continue as we move forward. So anyway, good work on that. The other thing I always like to point out is if we include the parcels acquired via eminent domain plus the parcels that are in green, we have over 750 parcels of land acquired to date. That does include parcel splits and other factors, but nonetheless, that's a lot of land. So we've made a lot of progress. Of course, we have a lot of flowage easements to acquire, and you can see the orange shaded parcels in the upstream area. Those are the parcels where the appraisal work, as Jody mentioned earlier, that appraisal work is done, being reviewed right now, and we look forward to presenting those appraisals to the joint board and the MCC-JPA board at the end of February, which will then trigger offers going out. And so we'll see a bunch of blue on the map shortly thereafter. The next page gives into more detail about environmental monitoring easements. This is an area where we're continuing to spend a bit of time and energy trying to reduce the number of easements that are still outstanding. I'm happy to report that in the last few weeks, I think we've had another 10 of these that have been signed. And again, the numbers here might not reflect that as we're waiting for all the paperwork to close, but making a little bit of progress there. And then the remaining pages of this report just drill into different areas in more detail using the usual box diagram showing progress of what's acquired and what's outstanding. So happy to answer any questions about that, but otherwise that's the highlights of the report.
Thank you, Eric. Any questions? Seeing none, we'll move on. Roger, do you have a report for us from the Water Resource District?
Just quickly, Eric did a good job of hitting most of the high points. Tomorrow we meet as a board, and we will be looking at making just compensation offer to a homeowner, and also looking at approving some farm rental contracts. We have several that need to be approved, so that we'll be looking at those tomorrow. And also, I did have one other thing. Yeah, the environmental easements, they continue to work on those. You know, that's kind of a tough thing for a landowner to get his head around that, or his hands around it. You know, what are going to be the impacts for a long time? And, you know, I have to sign this easement, and so that's, you know, been a process, and I think our land agents have done a pretty good job. We've increased the value of that easement back to the landowners, and I think that has generally been well accepted and has gotten some positive response. So at this time, that will end my report.
All right, thank you, Roger. And item number 9, the MCC GAPA, we have not met. We meet tomorrow. So probably at our board meeting tomorrow, we'll be able to report on some other things. I do know that tomorrow we're going to have our first executive session as the MCC JPA, and maybe we can report on something on that tomorrow. I have nothing further on that. Item number 10 is a committee update for the DA board, and that's just basically an outline of what we'll be giving tomorrow for the full board. Do we have any other business today? Any other business before the board? All right, next meeting will be on February 23rd here at 3 p.m. And is there a motion to adjourn?
Second.
We have a motion and a second. We are adjourned.